Is the first mover necessary or contingent?
I'm not sure. It may or may not be.
Okay. If it's contingent, then it requires the principle of sufficient reason, requires an explanation. So on and
So
so forth.
the way
Now,
around this would be an infinite regression.
fine. Now you have to explain the totality, all contingent things. Why do they exist?
Yeah, it's an infinite regression.
It doesn't matter if it's infinite, it's still an infinite contingent. So
Yeah,
if it's still contingent, it still requires an explanation.
Yeah, the explanation would be the next step, which goes on
That's
infinitely.
circular. You're saying
No,
the contingent
that's
thing,
not
it
circular.
is 100% circular. You're saying the contingent thing that requires an explanation is explained by the contingent thing that requires an explanation.
Yeah, that's not circular. That's just an infinite regression. That is not
circular. That's the definition. It doesn't matter if it's infinite regression.
Well, the other
all
explanation,
All of it.
the
Okay,
other.
so-
Hey, dude.
Nice
Yeah,
glasses.
your last discussion was kind of interesting, and I saw the thing that you have up on stream. Atheism is whack.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to debate that rather
Okay.
than the problem of evil. So atheism is merely the lack of belief in God. And I think depending on one's epistemic standards, I don't think the lack of belief in God is unreasonable. If you're going to make a claim that there is a God, could be any God, doesn't have to be any specific God, but especially if you're going to argue God by definition being an benevolent, all-powerful being, or just a being that is massively powerful that created the universe. If your epistemic standard is there needs to be adequate amount of proof of this, so that could be empirical proof, so we can actually find God, see him. It could be a certain preponderance of evidence. So whether enough people have seen him, whether it's logically possible for that God to exist, so on and so forth. As long as the epistemic standards are relatively reasonable, I don't know how you can claim that atheism is whack.
I can claim it's whack because it's like a positive claim. It's the claim that there is no God. If you want to claim like an agnostic claim, if you want to say I'm unsure, I don't know, or I haven't been
that's
convinced,
not the definition of atheism. It's just simply a lack of belief of God.
Atheist, right? Atheist, theist, the belief in a God. Atheist, the absence of belief in a God, right? The lack of a belief. You could say, I'm agnostic. I don't know if there is a God, and I haven't been convinced. That's fine. If that's the claim you want to make, sure. But if you're going to say atheist, there is no God, right? I lack the belief because there is no one, or it seems to be the standard that hasn't been convinced. I think you have to provide that naturalism seems to be the higher standard. Just like I used the example before, if I'm going to say that there is no Donald Trump as the president of the United States, I'm going to have to prove that claim.
Okay, so you don't have an issue with somebody who simply has a lack of belief in God, but would be convinced if there was an adequate preponderance of evidence.
Yeah, if you're simply stating that I don't know if there is or is not one, I haven't been convinced, yeah, sure, that's fine.
Okay, would you say dragons do not exist, or would you say I am not sure if dragons exist?
I haven't been convinced of a dragon.
But would you say they do not exist?
No, I wouldn't say that. Because there's like historical writings about dragons from like all cultures. It's a possibility that it could have happened.
Do you think it's possible to make a positive claim about the lack of existence of something if there is a great enough preponderance of evidence in support of that claim?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, is that you got to make a claim that the likelihood of the absence of that thing is high.
Okay. So if we take God to be a benevolent, all-powerful being, which I believe you do, correct?
Right. So here's the thing. You can make an argument that the classical idea of God is wrong. And even if that argument was to come to fruition and come to be true, then you could simply just pivot to an open theist idea of God. Or you can posit a limited God, or you could posit I don't know who the God was you brought up last time, like Grok or whatever it was. You can posit like that type of God, this Grok God, or a deistic God, or a pantheist type God. Ultimately, it wouldn't get you to atheism. It's an anti-belief. It's an anti your belief, rather a positive to my belief.
So This is going to be mostly about epistemic standards then. So if you're going to claim there's enough evidence to assume there's a possibility of dragons existing, that seems a little absurd to me, just based on, fairy
You've
tales.
never seen a dragon? That's the reason?
Well, not only have I never seen a dragon, no one has claimed to have seen a dragon.
There's writings about dragons from literally almost every culture around the world. And I'm not
Well,
making a
there's
positive claim
also
towards dragons. I'm just simply stating I haven't looked into it enough, and I'm not making the claim that there is no dragons.
so by that logic, you would have to assume there's a possibility that Zeus exists, that Apollo exists, that Thor exists.
I actually do believe in most of those gods, but I don't believe that they're the most high god.
Well, if that were so, there's nothing in Christianity that necessarily states that none of these other gods exist.
Yeah, it's called divine council theory, right? This is a common thing, as you can see in like Psalm 82, where it talks about the council of gods. You can see in Daniel 7, these councils fight against each other. You can see in Genesis that God went to judge the other gods of Egypt. So it seems that the Bible is in favor of these existence of other gods, but these other gods submit to the authority of, Yahweh Vadhe.
Right, but if you're going to claim like there that could lead to contradictions in other mythologies. So Odin, the High Father, he's the supreme god. Zeus is basically the father of all gods. He's the supreme ultimate god. That would create a contradiction.
That would be a contradiction if that was true. Zeus nor Odin are the supreme ultimate gods. They submit to a higher god as well. And those are type vague gods. So it was I think it was Zeus's Kronos was his father, right? And Kronos was created as well. And even in their own myths, these gods have beginnings and ends, right? And there's also the fact that we incorporate the fact that these gods are, from the Christian worldview, fallen angels. They're not exactly honest, good creatures.
Okay, and if we're going to assume there's a possibility that just because somebody wrote about these things that they could be true,
I wouldn't say just so just to clarify, I wouldn't say just because one guy wrote about something therefore it's true or it's even possible of being true. I'd say maybe possible of being true, but I wouldn't say likely. So, for example, the reason I concede to like the possibility of dragons is because so many cultures wrote about dragons throughout past. Like I haven't looked into enough to say it's a positive claim or a negative claim. Could have been the possibility that some sort of types of dragons existed in the past, and they were just very rare types of animals, and we haven't found their remains. That's a possibility. I don't think it's likely.
Right. So you'd say it's like very, very low probability, like less than 1%. You're talking about.
I'm not making I'm not giving a percentile at this point. I haven't looked into it enough to actually make a claim.
Sure, but you'd say it's a pretty low probability considering like fossil evidence. Nobody has directly claimed they've seen them, things like that.
I don't think fossil evidence is a good way to look at those types of things because we're finding animals now on the planet that we didn't know existed. This is like a common thing. It happens like every other month. We find like a new type of species.
Well, that's sort of true. I think there's been a new T-Rex specimen that was found, and it's being argued that it may be its own unique subspecies. But
I mean, even living species we find.
Well,
we find new living species.
That's primarily microorganisms and insects. But
and fish.
Yeah. So if you're going to say there is a very low probability of something like dragons,
well, I'm not making a claim because I haven't looked enough into it. Perhaps there is some sort of evidence I haven't seen, right? You're asking me to take a stance on something I haven't studied enough to take a stance on.
Okay, sure. Well, here's a thought experiment. Let's say rather than the Bible having a focus on, Jesus claiming to either be a prophet of God or a son of God, Jesus was claiming that dragons exist, and he is in communications with dragons, and depending on how you interpret some of the writings, Jesus claimed to also be a dragon. And some of his followers also said, well, I've seen Jesus
Right.
turn into a
I understand where you're going. If you're saying it was the same amount of evidence that Jesus was a dragon, that it says that he rose from the dead, would I believe he's a dragon? Is that the claim you're making?
well, yeah, let's just say the narrative is structurally is roughly identical, only rather than the narrative being about Jesus being in communication with God or being the Son of
Yeah,
God,
I believe he was a
it was
dragon.
about
Yes,
dragons.
I would
Would
believe he was a
you
dragon.
say there's a high likelihood that Jesus
Yeah,
was
if it was the same outcome, the same historical data, same historical evidence that Jesus was rather a dragon than the Son of God, I would believe he's a dragon. Yes.
okay?
Right. So what you're doing is you're appealing to absurdity. You're giving a
Well,
hypothetical
no,
that
I'm not.
you absolutely are.
I'm just
You're
questioning
giving
your epistemic standards.
well, no, you're appealing to absurdity. You're giving a hypothetical that just on the surface has an intuition pump that seems absurd, even though the data numerically is the same. So the data is still a one-to-one data, but you're giving something to the audience that sounds absurd, so it just seems ridiculous on the surface, even though the data is the same. I'm more
Well,
interested in interpreting the data rather than what seems absurd or not. I don't think it's good science to say this seems absurd, so therefore we should reject it.
right. So if you're going to have that sort of epistemic standard where people talking about this person who claimed to have been a dragon roughly 200 years after the fact,
That,
writing about it and creating.
that's not the case. The earliest writing that we have of Christ is like 1 to 5 years. This is 1 Corinthians 15:3. The later writings, like if we go to like John's epistles, will be 90 AD. This is plus what was it?
I'm not a
Plus plus
so
70 years. So this is
yeah,
not even remotely close to 200 years.
I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm pretty confident though Matthew is the earliest writing,
It's
and I
70
think the
AD. It's plus
earliest.
40.
Sorry.
It's 70 AD. It's plus 40. Jesus was executed in 33. Matthew is written, Mark is the earliest, according to scholars, is written in 70 AD. And they know that because of the destruction of the temple.
Right. So even if we're assuming that's true, somebody wrote about this as early as
It's
5
not assuming
years.
that's the consensus view. That's not even debated in scholarship.
I'm not a biblical scholar, so I'm not
Okay.
really able to adequately debate that topic. But assuming that is true, like we can just agree for the sake of argument.
Okay.
If your epistemic standard is one person wrote about this 5 years after the fact,
No.
in ancient history.
No. So I'm going to stop you again, because if you're going to critique my worldview, it's best to understand it. You say you're not a biblical scholar. That's fine. But you're critiquing a worldview that you haven't studied and read. Now,
Well, no, I'm
again,
not.
if you haven't
I'm
studied
not
and read it, we
critiquing your
can go through
worldview. I'm
it.
just critiquing your epistemic standards.
Right, but you're saying my epistemic standard is I believe something that one person wrote 5 years later. That's not the evidence that's presented for Christ.
It's a culmination of evidence. So there's multiple authors. Many of these authors did write about him many years after the fact. And there weren't many eyewitnesses to these
There's
events.
21 eyewitnesses.
Yeah, 21 eyewitnesses. Not all of them wrote about this. They also have differing accounts, and
Okay.
some of the differing accounts.
It's not as differing as you think. So 21 eyewitness accounts. Can you give me any other historical figure or historical event that has 21 eyewitness accounts?
Well, there's plenty. Like, I mean,
Can you give me just one?
Alexander the Great. That would have
Alexander the
been,
Great?
yeah, Alexander the Great. I mean, there would have been thousands of witnesses, and we also have. We don't have.
So who are these thousands of witnesses of Alexander the Great?
Well, his generals, people who actually met him. There were historians who also met him and wrote about him. Unfortunately, we don't have the original sources. Those have been lost.
I'm pretty sure
but there are other historians that were near his time that reference those original sources, which gives us pretty good evidence that Alexander the Great was in fact a real historical figure. He was also written about by other cultures.
Just a quick Google search. Alexander the Great, we only have 2 sources. And in these sources, I don't think from my research that they're actually giving the testimonies of people who knew Alexander the Great. Unless you can provide a source.
So these are historians that are referencing earlier contemporary historical works. We don't have the originals. Those have been lost to time. But historians who did have access to that literature relied on that literature and referenced it. So
okay, but like what are they referencing? What is this literature that you're speaking of? Like if I want to read about Alexander the Great, what am I going to open?
So again, this is kind of besides the point.
It's not beside the point, because you're making the claim that this is a one-to-one comparison, and I haven't been convinced of that standard.
I'm not making a one-to-one comparison. I'm just
but it is, because I asked you specifically. I said we have 21 eyewitness accounts throughout the Gospels and Acts, right? So we through these 5 books of Jesus Christ, and you say, well, we have Alexander the Great that would have thousands of eyewitness accounts. And I'm asking for like just a reference or a quote. I'm not like of anything, just so I know you're not like. I'm not making the claim that you are talking out of your butt, but just so I know you're not.
Well, I'm not a historical expert. This is some stuff that I've just picked up over time. But from what I understand, there are historians who met Alexander the Great, talked about him.
Yeah.
Those original manuscripts have been lost, but later historians reference those manuscripts.
Yeah.
So we know they existed, and these are multiple sources, multiple historians who have referenced those manuscripts. So in all likelihood,
so I don't deny Alexander the Great's existence.
The idea is we have reasonable epistemic standards in place to establish that Alexander the Great probably was a real historical figure. Now, some of the stories around him have not been historically verified. There's some pretty, crazy stories about him being like 10 feet tall or something, which is almost certainly not true.
Why?
But what?
Why is that almost certainly not true? Are there not 10 feet tall people?
I don't think anybody's ever reached 10 feet tall ever.
How tall is Yao Ming?
I think he's like 7'6" or something. Yao Ming also isn't the tallest person. I think the tallest person ever in recorded history was like 8'4" or something.
Right. So he's 7'6". You have a person who's like 8'4". So yeah, it's probably hyperbolic to 10 feet, but probably speaking of a really tall person.
Right, but again, actual historical sources, none of them mention his height as being particularly tall. But
do they say contrary to that?
The point I'm making is there are epistemic standards in place that historians will use. So they'll see if there's any contemporary. So they'll see if there's any contemporary writings at the time. They'll see if later historians talk about him and the stories kind of match up to contemporary writings.
Okay. So far,
there's archaeological evidence.
Okay. So far, the 3 things that you mentioned, we have of the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? We have those contemporary writings, we have later historians referencing, and we have archaeological evidence.
We don't.
So, yeah, we do. So we have 2 things.
Not all the Gospels. Not all the Gospels reference him arising from the dead.
Yeah, every single one of them does.
Conflicting stories about who found his...
Can you give me a gospel that doesn't reference him rising from the dead?
Isn't it only the one? Was it
all 4 of them? All 4 of them have a resurrection account.
Okay, maybe. The issue is, though, they likely were referencing each other.
Yeah, so we don't even deny that. That doesn't change anything. This is a common thing in history.
So
for example,
so it's relying on one source.
Yeah, but again, it's not an issue in history, because we have things like undesigned coincidences that show that they're pulling from their own memories and their own stories. We have the changes in that. It's most likely that they were using each other as notes, not an issue, because a lot of things, I forget who it is. I don't know if Than's still listening. He would have a reference to this. There's a gentleman who wrote a lot of history in World War II. He was actually there in World War II, but when he was writing his history, he referred to what other people wrote, even though he was there and physically seen it. And yet we take his history as being logically sound and something that we could take to be accurate and correct. This is not an issue in history. Like, scholars don't look upon the copying of other sources and saying, okay, then we have to throw it away.
Right, but this does fundamentally come down to only one source.
No, it's not one source. So for example, we have in the Gospel of Mark, we have Jesus talking about there will not be a sign given, but in the Gospel of Matthew, we have the expanded version of why there wouldn't be a sign given because of the sign would only be from Jonah. So it seems to be that Mark is trying to get the gist of the story. Matthew is trying to do more of like a Midrash type thing. So he's giving more of the story of what Mark did. Mark is written in the sense that it's somebody is supposed to be speaking it. It's not written in the sense that it's supposed to be read. So it's designed to be memorized and spoken out to the people. So he had that written. He's going off getting the gist. Matthew, he's writing more of a comprehensive story. It's most likely that when writing that to keep continuity, he would have referenced Mark.
So are all of these authors actually witnessed the resurrection?
No. So it would have been Matthew and John that would have witnessed the resurrection.
So there's two people who claim to have actually seen it.
No, there's 21 people that have claimed to have seen it.
Okay, there's 21 people who have claimed to have seen it.
Mm-hmm.
Only 2 of them ever wrote about it. And all of these other authors are claiming, are referencing those works.
Cool. So do you only take information from people who wrote it themselves? So you reject all news articles and news stations?
Well, the issue is you're talking about events that happened.
Well, but hold on. Don't just brush away what the question I'm asking you. Do you only take firsthand accounts as evidence? Because if that's the case, you have to reject all newspapers, news stations, historical reports, historical books.
So when I'm looking at a news report, I always look at firsthand accounts. I'm going to take secondhand accounts with a massive, massive grain of salt.
Okay, so when a news report records, again, we're just talking about him. I'm just going to use him for an example. I don't know how you feel about him. News report records Donald Trump said this, right, and gives a quote for that. You instantly say that's not a good source. You have to see Donald Trump actually say it or actually get a book of him writing it and saying it.
Yeah,
and you do that for every bit of information that you ever receive.
Yes. So if somebody claims Donald Trump said something and they cite the source as the New York Times, I'm going to go to the New York Times and see what they wrote about it.
Right. Otherwise, that's not what you're misunderstanding my question. So then you're taking New York Times, not Donald Trump.
Well, again, if the New York Times has the actual interview, then that's the primary source.
Right. So then if John or for example, in Luke, where he says he's recording from the people that witness this, then Luke is the primary source.
So, yeah, that's an issue.
Why?
If these people,
with sorry,
well, wait, so you're talking about events that happened roughly 2,000 years ago.
What difference does
that
make?
You're relying on one single person's testimony or maybe
hold on. You're just saying 2,000 years ago and brushing it off. What difference does it make if the historical report was written today or if it was written 2,000 years ago? If you can reference,
there's a lot of issues.
Give me the issue.
There's a lot of issues. So we know the Bible's gone through multiple translations. It's gone through multiple alterations or many alterations.
Okay. Let's pause there. Can you prove that claim?
Yes. You can look at. Yeah. So you can. So I'm not a biblical scholar. But
so I'll give you a reference on the Isaiah scroll that's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would be probably about 2,200 years before Christ, something like that, or 2,200 years from us, about 200 to 400 years before Christ. This has about a 94% accuracy to the Isaiah scroll that we have now. So what is your evidence that this has been changed and altered over time?
You've just admitted it's been altered.
A 94% accuracy is extremely high. And that's not alterations.
First of all, there's different ways of calculating accuracy. One of them is with what's it called? Like actual spelling. I'm not. You can look at the spelling of words. You can look at the meaning behind the words. You can look at the accuracy of the translation. It kind of depends on.
So let me rephrase. The 94% accuracy is the narrative.
Right. Sure. And that's roughly what you'd find with a lot of religious texts.
Right. So you're making the claim that it's been changed and altered over years to the point that we can't trust it anymore.
So you've just admitted there's a 6% margin of error.
You're telling me I can't trust
this.
You're telling me I can't trust an A
You
grade?
just admitted. You've just admitted there's a 6% margin of error in these religious texts.
So over 2,000 years, we've seen a 6% margin of error, and you're saying we cannot trust.
That's not over 2,000 years.
Yes, the Isaiah scroll is plus 2,000 years. So again, we see a 6% error, and you're saying that's a problem, and we have an A+ grade. Like if I got 94% in my class, I'm getting a scholarship to go to university, bro.
Well, look, let's go with the 6% margin of error. Let's say these gospels have only changed 6% over, since their original source. Like, we can point to translation issues within the gospels. The idea that Jesus was born of a virgin, that's pretty clearly a translation error from Greek, where virgin at that point in time
that's an assumption. You're talking about the word betula, right? That came from the Isaiah scroll. You're making an assumption that Matthew would have read it, and you're assuming he's performing some type of form of midrash. There is no issue in the translation, because what you're saying is because in the Septuagint, it said betula, which in the Hebrew it says betula, but in the Septuagint it gave a word that specifically meant virgin, and you're assuming that Matthew read it and made an error from the Septuagint because it was in Greek, and then inserted that.
I don't know if Matthew specifically made that error, but
it's Matthew. That's the argument.
Yeah, the word as far as I understand, this is pretty well agreed upon among scholars, that virgin meant unmarried woman, not woman who had never had sex.
No, this is an argument for contention. So I'll give you that it seems to be the consensus, but it's a minority consensus, not a majority consensus.
Okay. I don't know enough about biblical scholarship to really argue that point very well, but
here's the thing: you're assuming Matthew is reading Isaiah and then making the claim that he's pulling the prophecy from Isaiah.
Look, you can. So let's just, for the sake of argument, just roll with this for a little bit and say it's up in the air. The direct translation from Greek, to English might be virgin. Those words can mean very different things depending on the culture that uses them. Now, that is a direct translation. As far as the direct translation, there's no error there, and you can say that is a perfect. There's no error in the translation. There's no technical error in the translation. But that is an alteration from the original meaning. And that could be the only error from, the Gospels until now. But that changes a huge amount of Christian philosophy.
No, it does. You're misunderstanding my argument. You're misunderstanding my argument, because the contention of the translation isn't our translation. It was Matthew's translation. That's the contention. It's that Matthew was reading Isaiah, the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of Isaiah. And the Septuagint in Greek translated the Hebrew word for virgin to the Greek word of virgin. And then Matthew pulled theology from the Greek word rather than the Hebrew word. That's the assumption being made. It's not what we're reading. It's what Matthew read. So you're assuming you're assuming a theological goal that Matthew had when you're reading the text. It's very possible.
I'm not assuming a theological goal.
You have to be. That's the argument. He might not
have understood Greek.
That's the argument. That you're assuming a theological goal. You're assuming he read the Greek, read the virgin passage, performed midrash, and then put it in the Gospel of Matthew.
That's not a theological goal. He may have genuinely tried to translate accurately, but just didn't
when
understand
someone's performing midrash, what are they doing?
Well, they're trying to accurately translate.
No, that's not midrash.
What do you mean by midrash?
Midrash is a Jewish practice where you took Old Testament prophecy and then tried to give commentary or a better understanding of it. The Gospel of Matthew is primarily midrash because Matthew is pulling largely from prophecy in the Old Testament. So you're assuming that he is referring to the Isaiah verse, right? And he understands a mistranslation of it, and then he's putting in the virgin narrative in his
I'm
gospel.
not assuming he knows it's a mistranslation.
Well, then if you're not assuming that, you have no argument, because that is the argument you're bringing forward. That's the argument the scholars bring forward.
The argument I was making is he may have misunderstood the meaning in Greek.
Yeah, so he would misunderstand it in Greek and then perform Midrash to put it into his verse.
No, the misunderstanding is he didn't know the meaning of the word. So he thought it meant woman who had never had sex.
Yes.
But what it really meant was unmarried woman.
Yes.
And then when he translated it, he meant
translating. Matthew didn't translate it. Matthew did not translate the Septuagint. That wasn't his goal. Matthew was performing Midrash. So when he read that, he would assume what you're saying. I agree with you. He's saying it's assumes virgin, and then he's performing Midrash and putting that into his gospel. That's what I'm saying. You have to assume his theological narrative. You're assuming that Matthew wants to make Jesus this figure that's born from a virgin woman. And to assume that, you'd have to say that he read the Old Testament's mistranslation.
This man is bilingual, correct?
What do you mean bilingual?
So he would be able to understand Greek and Hebrew.
I assume so, but if you're going to make that argument, it's not going to help your case.
Then how is the translation made?
Because he didn't translate. You understand that Matthew didn't translate the Septuagint, right? Can you just say that you understand that?
Okay. I thought that was the argument you were making.
No, Midrash is not translation. Midrash is theological understanding of the Old Testament. It's pulling from prophecy. It's not translating. When the Septuagint is the Old Testament written in Greek. The New Testament was also written in Greek. The mistranslation comes from before Jesus. That's the argument that scholars are making, that the word Betula in the Hebrew doesn't mean virgin, it means young woman. Except the problem is Betula every time in the Old Testament. Hold on. The problem is Betula every time in the Old Testament is only ever used for virgin women.
Okay, then I think we're just talking past each other because then
I understand everything
somebody else
said. You misunderstand what I'm saying.
Then somebody else would have been making the translation error.
Right, but that's the thing. You're saying Christians would have a theological problem today. They wouldn't, because you're assuming Matthew is performing this theological development. You haven't proven that case.
The point again, we just to make my argument clear. From what I understand, this is the consensus with most biblical scholars, is that
it's a minority consensus.
Okay, I'm not sure. I don't really have a great enough ability to argue against that, but the contention is Mary being mentioned as a virgin meant unmarried woman. And
no, that's not the argument they're making.
Not women who had not had sex.
Right. That's not even remotely in the conversation of
is it possible? Is it?
No. The argument you're making, I'm going to stop you because the argument you're making, no scholar makes. So again, I'm trying to give you the argument so you can.
They absolutely do.
I'll give you $20. I'll give you $20 if you can show me a scholar that says
cosmic.
that specifically says that Matthew, right, is saying that Mary was a young woman.
I'm not making that argument specifically, but that's
the argument that you're presenting. So I would like to give you the argument you're trying to give. I already
explained this. So
I'd like to give you the argument you're trying to give. I want to give it to you. I don't listen. I know the argument you're trying to do. I've heard people do it. I want to give it to you so you understand it, so you can present it properly in the future. Is that okay? Like, I'm not trying to get you in a gotcha here.
Yeah, so the argument I'm making, it doesn't really matter who made the translation, Matthew or somebody who translated from Hebrew to whatever language later. The argument that some scholars make is that Mary was not originally written as a virgin. She was, so by the way, we mean virgin today, woman who had never had sex. It was written as a woman who was unmarried.
No, that's not the argument they make. So I'll give you the argument they make.
I just explained the argument I was making.
Okay, who makes that?
So that is the argument I'm making.
Okay, who makes that argument?
Now, yeah, Cosmic Skeptic actually just recently interviewed him.
Cosmic Skeptic is not a scholar.
Yeah, no, I'm saying Cosmic Skeptic interviewed him. I have to get his name. Bart Evan.
Bart Ehrman?
Or sorry, Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, so Bart Ehrman's argument on this is that Matthew was reading the Old Testament, was reading a verse in Isaiah, that in Isaiah, in the Septuagint, it says a specific Greek word that means virgin. But when it was originally in Hebrew, it used the word betula. The word betula could have meant young woman, not virgin. It didn't have to mean virgin. Matthew.
Yeah, there was a different term for that
Right. Yeah.
specifically.
Matthew was reading Isaiah and he's performing Midrash. He's trying to pull prophecy from the Old Testament. So
Right, sure.
Matthew read the word in Greek, virgin. And so what he did is he wrote Mary in as a virgin. Wasn't that it was a misunderstanding, or originally Matthew didn't? Matthew was always written as she was a virgin, but it comes from Matthew's misunderstanding of Isaiah. That's the argument Bart Ehrman makes.
Right.
Right. And that's all I was trying to get through to you. Like, I'm not trying to get you in a gotcha.
No, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We've resolved that.
Okay.
So would you say there is a possibility, no matter how small, that Bart Ehrman may be correct in that analysis?
So logically possible, sure. But I don't think
so. So are you agnostic as to whether or not the Trinity is true?
No, I'm not agnostic. You're just asking like a logical possibility? Sure. Yeah, it's a logical possibility, but I don't think it's a probable possibility. I don't think it's likely considering in Hebrew that word betula, which is what meant young woman. If you look at every verse in the Old Testament where betula is used, it's always referencing a virgin. It never references a married woman or a woman who has sex. So I actually think Matthew was reading the Hebrew. I don't think he's reading the Septuagint. I think Bart's wrong on this.
Okay, I'd have to look into that. I'm not sure if that's true. But if you're going to say it's possible, then I don't know how you can't be agnostic as to the existence of the Trinity if you're going to demand that I be agnostic to the existence of God or dragons, just because people have talked about this and it's possible.
I really don't understand the argument you're trying to bring forward here.
Yeah, so you said, in your thing on screen, you said atheism is whack. So anyone who, claims that there is no God,
the virgin, my foundation of my belief doesn't rest on the virgin birth.
Well, sure, I understand that, but I'm just saying, if you're going to say agnosticism is the only reasonable position to have when it comes to things that are either possible, like that have a possibility. So God could exist, God could not exist. So the only reasonable position would be agnosticism, not the statement
that's
or the position that God does not exist.
Yeah, that's not my original. My original argument is that atheism doesn't have a high probability or a good argument. So therefore, the only thing that you can do is say I'm agnostic and I don't know.
Okay.
That's my argument, right? So just because there's other possibilities doesn't mean that there isn't like high probabilities and possibilities. So I think there are higher probabilities for deism, higher probabilities for the Christian God. I think looking at scripture, there's higher probabilities that there's less issues, that is historically reliable. There might be contrary arguments that are logically possible, sure, but I think the probability states I should take this stance. I think it's the better stance to take. I don't think there is any good arguments for atheism, so I don't think it's a good stance to take.
Just based on probability.
Well, I'm just saying I haven't heard an argument for atheism.
Well, there isn't exactly an argument for atheism. It's merely a lack of belief. But we've talked about this before on our last debate, the problem of evil. If you're going to claim that there's an all-powerful benevolent God, I would say the absolute best argument would be problem of evil. But I don't know if you really want to hash that out again.
Yeah, we've already done the problem of evil. I see where that goes, so we don't need to go through it again. So yeah, here's the thing. I could grant you that, and all we disprove is a benevolent God, all powerful. It could be a limited God that's not benevolent, right? We just shift the goalposts. You have open theism, you have classical theism, you have deism, you have pantheism. You have all these ideas of God, and all these have arguments. If you want to make an argument against classical theism, go for it. But you don't make an argument for atheism.
Yeah. So just to wrap things up, it's possible that depending on your definition of God, a God could exist. There are some people who believe that if a being is not all powerful and omnibenevolent, then by definition, it's not God. But there are many different cultures throughout history that thought gods were just very powerful beings that may have lived in some alternate realm, like a spirit realm or something.
Now,
Now,
I'll just clarify what I mean then. First cause that has a mind.
okay. First cause that has a mind. I don't know, like it's not really possible to make an argument against that. It's at least right now, it's not really a falsifiable claim. Maybe in the future we'll have some sort of scientific evidence that could falsify that. But if you're just going to,
I don't think you need to falsify it. I think you just need to give me a probable case for naturalism.
Well, I mean, it could just be a first cause without a mind. Could just be some special particle.
Yeah. Then that becomes ad hoc and arbitrary, and it defines the principle of sufficient reason.
No, I don't see how it's any more or less arbitrary than the notion that a first cause would have to have a mind.
Okay, so
that seems more ad hoc and arbitrary. Okay, because you're adding a mind to the equation.
Okay. So first cause sets everything into motion. Why isn't everything that's set into motion random?
A mind could generate randomness.
It could, but it has an option not to, right? So if it has no mind, it has all power, right? The ability to create this first cause, it at least has more power than everything that's in existence.
It doesn't necessarily have all power.
But it has more power than everything that's in existence, right?
Well,
because you can't create or destroy energy.
Cause, I suppose. I don't know what you mean by more power exactly.
So obviously, if it created the universe, it couldn't be weaker than the universe. It couldn't have less properties than the universe, correct?
I don't know why that would necessarily be the case.
So you're saying this thing that is ad hoc has the ability to create something ex nihilo?
Well, I mean, it would make logical sense to me that you could have a being that's quite powerful, able to create something that's more powerful than itself.
Well, that's ex nihilo.
Yeah, I don't know why that would either be a logical contradiction or so improbable that, it shouldn't be something that's considered.
Okay,
we're developing artificial intelligence. Yeah. We can create pretty amazing things.
So you have a necessary particle that's creating things ex nihilo. So therefore it has a substantial amount of more power than it is. Why don't we expect to see random chaos, things like planets popping in and out of existence, unicorns coming in and out of existence, flat planets, square planets, lights and colors changing? Why don't we see that happening?
It could just be due to the unique properties of this, first cause.
Okay, so then it has arbitrary limits. For some reason, it has properties, just for no reason.
Well, I mean, I think your God has arbitrary limits, does it not?
Yeah, we can get into that. So, but first,
claim...
let's go through this, right? So this thing just has random limits for no reason.
What do you mean no reason? I don't know what reason is really.
So principle of sufficient reason states that, anything that is requires an explanation. So if you're saying that this thing for some reason has limits, right? It's not chaos. It's not random, right? It's creating something in some form of order. It's just doing that. Therefore, there must be some sort of limitation put on it to stop the randomness.
Well, you're using words that are kind of implying intelligent design for not really any reason.
I'm not applying intelligent design at all.
Well, when you use a word like reason, you could use the word reason to mean, okay, why did I could lift an object like my phone and drop it? What's the reason that it? What's the reason?
Hold on. Do you deny principle of sufficient reason?
I don't know what that is. You're going to have to explain. But what I'm saying is you could use there's different ways you can use reason. So what's the reason the phone falls down to earth?
Yeah, there's a reason.
Well, gravity. We understand the force of gravity.
Yeah.
But you could also use reason in a kind of normative sense where it's, what's the reason behind our existence?
Yeah, that's all fine. So principle of sufficient reason, right, just states that everything that is or happening all has some sort of explanation. So you can say, what's the reason for our existence? That's basically the question you're asking. What is the reason we come into existence? What's the reason the phone dropped? We can answer that question.
Yeah,
we can
so by reason, So by reason, you just mean what
Oh,
are
no.
the property?
No,
Why?
not the properties. It's the why, right? So principle of sufficient reason is in the scientific method.
And yeah, and by why you mean like what are the physical or scientific explanations for why this happened,
Right.
or
So
explanation behind why it happened?
right. And if you want to deny the principle of sufficient reason, you deny the scientific method because they go hand in hand.
Well, I'm not denying that.
Okay.
Yeah, so
All right. So
I
fine.
I I wouldn't yeah,
The
so I
the
wouldn't I wouldn't be able to explain to you why the first cause particle has certain properties to it which would create the universe the way it is, just as you wouldn't really be able to explain why God is all powerful or
right. I
benevolent.
haven't
Like
even
what
I haven't even
forces.
got to God yet. I think you're just
Yeah.
assuming my argument and trying to defeat it before I even get there. So
Well,
again,
no, I'm just saying if you're going to claim there's arbitrary limits that can't be explained, I mean, you could say the same thing for
right. I haven't even
your
got to
claim of
God
God.
yet. So again, are you holding to the point that this necessary particle has these arbitrary limits that are just there ad hoc?
I don't know what you mean by arbitrary or ad hoc.
So it means there's no reason for it to be there. It just is.
Well, there could be. I'm not all knowing, unfortunately. I wish we could ask, God, these questions, but I'm not sure. There could be a scientific explanation. Um, it I really wouldn't be able to tell you what the beginning of the universe looked like or why it
Yeah, you
happened,
don't need to
but
know at the beginning of the universe. You just need to like use basic logic here. So if you have something, you have contingent things. I'm a contingent thing. I could be a different way. Yes.
yeah.
Okay, if I could be a different way, then I am contingent. I am not necessary. Therefore, it requires a principle of sufficient reason for me to be here. There must be some sort of explanation. Okay, well, let's say we figure the explanation is my parents. Well, then that requires an explanation, so on and so forth. Then we have the totality of contingent things. All contingent things are in existence. Well, we must say, hey, there has to be a reason for it to be in existence. We must get to some sort of necessary thing. We disagree?
Um, there must be a necessary thing that created something.
There just has to be a necessary thing. So whatever is before all has to be necessary, because if it's contingent, well, then you have to ask the question, why is it contingent if it could be another way? There has to be some. So for example, existence in itself is necessary for me and you to have this conversation,
Okay.
right? So when we get to
I'm pretty sure I'm following.
cool, so we go all the way back to the beginning of the universe. We have to have some sort of necessary being, right? This whatever it might not have a mind. It just has to be. It could be like you're saying. It could be just some sort of brute fact particle. Well, the problem is, if it's just some brute fact particle, well, we need some sort of explanation for why it's doing what it's doing, right? What would we expect to see if this brute fact particle is creating things ex nihilo, like you were saying, putting things in the
Right.
universe? We would expect to see chaos happening all sorts of different directions. Except you
Well, the issue here is we can make these same assumptions under the God hypothesis.
I haven't got to God yet. I don't know why you keep jumping to God. We haven't even got there yet. All I'm doing is refuting the atheistic worldview. I haven't even
Well, there's
posited
no
God. I don't know why you keep
refutation.
going to God.
There's no refutation. I just don't see a logical problem with assuming there could be some sort of special particle or
Yeah,
weird science
I'm
thing that
trying to get
created
there,
the
but
universe.
every time I try to get there, you cut me off and say, "But it doesn't work for God."
Well, the same criticisms could be made for God. That's what I'm pointing
But I
out.
haven't even gotten to my conclusion yet.
Well,
And
okay.
then
Well,
you
I'm
just say,
sorry. I don't mean to cut you off.
but I've been cutting you off. That's fine. But it's the conclusion you're trying to assume I'm going to.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't you just finish your explanation?
Okay. So this thing, this necessary particle that creates everything, it's creating everything. It's not random. Question for you I have to ask you is, could it be random?
Um, what do you mean by random?
So for example, this necessary particle creates the whole universe, right? Could it done it in a way where just unicorns are popping in and out of existence? The earth is flat, but the moon is a triangle.
I have no idea.
Okay, well, if it can't, right, if it can't be, and it has to be a specific way, that means there's ad hoc limits on it. The ad hoc limits defy the principle of sufficient reason, which means it defines science, which means it doesn't work. Now,
Not necessarily. It really depends on where this particle came from.
well, it doesn't come from anything. That was if it comes from something, it's not contingent. Or it's
Well,
contingent. It's not necessary.
It could come from the future, and we're just living on a loop where the universe expands, contracts, blah blah blah. We could have an infinite regression.
Oh, bro, we just went full circle. It still doesn't explain. We already agreed. We agreed at the start of this conversation that it was necessary. So why are you bringing back to the fact that it's contingent?
Well, I mean, the universe had to begin for me to be here. Like that would be necessary. Like the universe in its current state.
Right. Is the first mover necessary or contingent?
I'm not sure. It may or may not be.
Okay. If it's contingent, right? If it's a contingent thing, well, then it requires the principle of sufficient reason, requires an explanation, which means the thing before it is contingent or necessary, requires an explanation.
Okay. So the way around this would be an infinite regression.
Fine. Infinite regression. Now you have to explain the totality, all contingent things. Why do they exist?
Yeah, it's an infinite regression.
But you have to explain the totality of it.
Well, it's infinite.
It doesn't matter if it's infinite. It's still an infinite contingent.
Yeah, so the particle created God particle, created God particle, created God particle, created God particle.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I agree it's infinite. I agree it's infinite. But an infinite contingent is still contingent.
Right.
So if it's still contingent, it still requires an explanation.
Yeah, the explanation would be the next step, which goes on infinitely.
That's circular. You're saying the contingent thing, it's 100% circular. You're saying the contingent thing that requires an explanation is explained by the contingent thing that requires an explanation.
Yeah, that's not circular. That's just an infinite regression. That is not
circular. That's the definition. It doesn't matter if it's infinite regression.
Well, the other explanation, explanation I talked about, where time is in some loop, that's literally like that would be circular.
It doesn't matter if it's in a loop. It doesn't matter if it's infinite. It doesn't matter if it's a loop. Do you know what the word totality means?
Well, you can't have a totality. Like, I don't know what you mean by totality of infinity.
All of it.
You're not like, what's the logical problem with something like an infinite regression?
I'm not giving a logical problem for an infinite regression. I'm saying even with an infinite regression, you still have the same problem.
No.
Yes. So because the totality. Okay. So what does totality mean?
So we go to the point where the Big Bang happens, the universe expands. We go before that with, the God particle. And then we have the God particle being created by another God particle, another God particle creating another God particle. And you just
I know what an infinite regression is. I know what an infinite regression is.
So I don't see a logical problem with that.
Because again, I'm asking you for the totality of the infinite regression. What is the explanation?
I don't know how that's possible. It's an infinite regression.
It's infinite. All of it. Explain all of it.
I don't know how to explain it any further. It's an infinite regression. It goes on to infinity.
Right. So you're giving me a circular answer.
That's not a circular answer.
You're saying infinite regression is the answer because of infinite regression.
Well, let me ask you this. Has God always existed?
I don't know why you keep jumping. I haven't made an argument for God.
The issue, so the issue we have is whether or not there's a greater probability of atheism versus the God hypothesis.
Right, but what you're doing is you're denying science, you're denying the principle of sufficient reason, and you're using circular logic to make you say atheism is the correct way.
No,
so you're giving me a fallacy and then two denials.
No, I'm not. I'm not denying anything. We're trying to examine whether there's a greater probability.
Give me your conclusion again, and we'll see if it's circular. What is the explanation for the totality of contingent things?
Yeah, totality of contingent things. So it would be a single moment in time that was created by a God particle, that was created by a God particle, that was created by a God particle, traveling back infinitely in time.
Okay. So what created that?
I just gave the explanation.
Circular. The infinite regress created the infinite regress, created the infinite regress, created the infinite regress. That's circular.
Okay, so is God circular because he always existed?
No, we haven't gotten to God yet, bro. Anyways, we're at a stalemate.
Well,
I don't think I'm gonna get through to you.
We're comparing the probability of
I'm
hypotheses.
gonna jump on, bro. All
right,
I appreciate your time.
Thanks for the chat anyway.
God bless.
Take care.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. If you want to watch more, you can click one of these and you can keep watching.